The first sound was the fire alarm, a deafening rhythmic shriek that tore through the cheerful, chaotic hum of the Northwood Middle School annual science fair. The sound was an assault, a physical presence that silenced the excited chatter and bubbling ambition in an instant. The gymnasium moments before a bustling marketplace of adolescent ingenuity, a vibrant landscape of baking soda volcanoes, potato clocks, and elaborate self-contained ecosystems, in glass tanks abruptly descended into a vortex of panicked confusion. Students, their faces painted with a sudden raw alarm, began moving towards the exits in a disorganized, fearful surge, their meticulously crafted projects left abandoned on folding tables. My own heart gave a single hard hammer against my ribs, a reflexive jolt of pure adrenaline. But 15 years as an FBI Field Supervisor, a career built on navigating chaos, had forged a dam of training and discipline that now held back the flood of panic. The initial surge was instantly suppressed, replaced by the cold, swift current of professional assessment. My eyes practiced, and dispassionate scanned the room, automatically cataloging the exits, the potential choke points, the expressions on the faces in the crowd. I was triaging the threat, a grim, involuntary habit. But my primary focus, the anchor point of my entire world in that swirling moment, was my son Jordan. He stood frozen beside his project, a magnificent 6-foot-tall model of Mount St. Helens that he had poured the last 4 months of his young life into. It was far more than a simple papier-mâché cone. It was a marvel of amateur engineering and chemistry, complete with a pressurized internal chamber and a multi-stage chemical reaction system he had designed to simulate the awesome, terrible power of a pyroclastic eruption. This project was his passion, the tangible result of countless hours spent in our garage and his potential ticket to a prestigious state science scholarship. Now, it was just a piece of scenery in a rapidly developing crisis, an island in a sea of fear. His face, usually so animated and bright when explaining the intricacies of his work, was pale, and still his eyes wide with a specific kind of dread that had nothing to do with the geological forces he so admired. It was the bewildered fear of a child who has just seen his dream become a nightmare. Then I saw them, and the cold dread in my gut solidified into a block of ice. They were not firefighters in heavy turnout gear. They were members of the county bomb squad. 2 imposing figures in thick, dark tactical gear moved deliberately through the parting crowd, their movements economical and grim, their presence an immediate and terrifying escalation. They were followed by uniformed police officers who began to unfurl long strips of yellow tape, cordoning off the entire section of the gymnasium where Jordan's project stood. My son, my brilliant gentle boy, was suddenly on the wrong side of a police line. My gaze was drawn as if by a magnet across the gymnasium, past the fleeing crowds to the main entrance. And there, standing just inside the doorway, silhouetted against the bright afternoon light, was Carol Peterson. She was our neighbor, the self-appointed and ever-vigilant watchdog of our quiet suburban street. She was not looking at the bomb squad, nor at the evacuating students. Her attention, laser-focused and intense, was fixed on Jordan's volcano. Her face was a mask of tight-lipped righteous and vindicated fear. In that single damning expression, I saw the answer to the question that was screaming in my mind. She didn't see a brilliant 13-year-old boy's ambitious science project. She saw a weapon. She saw a threat. And I knew with a certainty that was as absolute and cold as the grave that she was the one who had made the call. This was not a misunderstanding. This was not an overreaction. This was a deliberate act of sabotage, an attack fueled by a paranoia so profound and a prejudice so deep that it had manifested as a federal incident. She had brought the full, terrifying weight of a counterterrorism response down on a middle school science fair to neutralize a perceived threat that existed only in her own twisted imagination. She thought she was saving the community from my son. She had no idea that she had just made herself the primary target of a federal investigation that I would personally and relentlessly oversee. She had no idea that I would bring the full crushing weight of the United States government down upon her to get justice for the boy she had just tried to brand as a terrorist. Our life in the quiet tree-lined enclave of Maple Run was a carefully constructed sanctuary, a world of order and peace I had meticulously built for Jordan after his mother, my brilliant and beloved Sarah, had been taken from us by cancer 3 years prior. My work as the supervising agent of the FBI's domestic terrorism squad for our region was a life lived in shadows and high stakes. I navigated a world of credible threats of radicalized ideologies and of the dark, simmering hatred that festers in the quiet corners of the country. My days were a blur of classified intelligence reports, the careful management of undercover operations, and the making of decisions that carried the undeniable weight of life and death. It was a world that demanded a certain professional detachment, a clinical ability to analyze and neutralize threats without emotion. Coming home to Jordan each night was my anchor to a different, better world. He was the living, breathing counterbalance to the darkness I faced each day. He was a brilliant, funny, and endlessly curious 13-year-old who saw the world not as a landscape of potential threats, but as a series of fascinating, interconnected problems waiting to be solved. He had his mother's fiercely inquisitive mind and my own methodical nature. Science was his passion, the language he used to communicate with the universe. Our two-car garage had been wholly ceded to his pursuits. It no longer smelled of oil and gasoline, but of solder, isopropyl alcohol, and the faint, earthy scent of the mineral composites he used for his models. His science fair project was his magnum opus, the culmination of his interests. For 4 solid months, he had dedicated himself to creating a geothermal pressure and multi-stage eruption model. It was a staggeringly sophisticated system involving a reinforced pressurized chamber and a complex series of timed chemical reactions he had meticulously researched, tested, and documented. The final result was designed to be a controlled, entirely non-toxic, yet visually spectacular eruption of dense foam, harmless steam, and colored biodegradable smoke. It was his ticket, he hoped with all the fervor of his young heart, to a coveted spot in the summer program at the state's top institute for science and technology, a dream he had been nurturing for years. I was endlessly, boundlessly proud of his dedication and his quiet, unassuming genius. We had moved to Maple Run 2 years ago, seeking the top-rated schools and the illusion of normalcy that my job so often lacked. The neighborhood was idyllic, a perfect postcard of suburban tranquility and affluence. But even in paradise, there are always snakes. Our snake was Carol Peterson. Carol was a widow in her late 60s, a retired office manager who had filled the void in her life by appointing herself the neighborhood's chief sentinel and moral arbiter. She patrolled the wide, curving streets in her sensible beige sedan, her eyes scanning constantly for infractions: a recycling bin left at the curb an hour too long, a patch of lawn in need of mowing, an unfamiliar car parked on the street for more than a day. Her formal complaints to the Homeowners Association were the stuff of local legend. But her vigilance was rooted in something deeper and more corrosive than a simple desire for tidiness. It was a gnawing, ever-present, and deeply unsettling fear. She saw potential threats in every deviation from her established norm. The inciting incident, the moment her generalized free-floating paranoia found a specific target in my son, had happened a month before the science fair. Jordan was in our backyard, conducting a small-scale test of one of his chemical compounds. The reaction produced a small, entirely harmless puff of orange smoke that smelled faintly of vinegar and dissipated in seconds. Carol, who had been meticulously trimming her hedges with electric shears, saw it. Later that evening, she was at our door, her face a mask of strained politeness. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice tight and clipped, "I don't mean to pry, but I was quite concerned by the smoke I saw coming from your yard earlier. Are you conducting some sort of experiment back there?" "It's for my son's science project, Carol." I had explained patiently, trying to project a neighborly calm. It's a chemical reaction for his model volcano. I assure you it's completely non-toxic and harmless. Her eyes narrowed slightly, flicking nervously towards our closed garage door. It seemed quite volatile, she pressed. And the smells coming from your garage lately. With all the terrible things you hear on the news these days, one simply can't be too careful. Is it really wise to be allowing a child to play with such things? The condescension in her tone, the implication that Jordan was merely playing, ignited a spark of irritation in me. He is not playing, Carol. I replied, my voice becoming firmer than I intended. He is conducting a controlled scientific experiment for a major school project. I am supervising him at all times. He is perfectly safe, and so is the neighborhood. I had meant to reassure her, to end the conversation with a definitive statement of fact. But I see now that I had in fact done the opposite. I had dismissed her fears. I had challenged her assessment of a threat. In her mind, I had revealed myself as a negligent parent, and my son as an unsupervised amateur chemist, building an unstable device just a few doors down. Her fear, once a diffuse and unfocused cloud, had found its lightning rod. The bomb threat at the science fair was not an impulsive, irrational act. It was the final, desperate culmination of a month of escalating fear and a terrifyingly twisted sense of civic duty. In her own mind, she was a hero, a lone voice of reason sounding the alarm on a clear and present danger that everyone else was too blind or too foolish to see. The evacuation of the school was swift and unnervingly orderly, a testament to the countless active shooter and emergency drills that were a sad, baked-in necessity of modern American childhood. Jordan and I were directed to a holding area on the far side of the football field with the hundreds of other parents and students. The flashing lights of a dozen police cars and emergency vehicles painted the chaotic scene in silent, strobing strokes of red and blue. Jordan was quiet, his shoulders slumped in his favorite hoodie. The earlier excitement and bubbling pride he had felt now completely extinguished, replaced by a heavy, bewildered shame. The bomb squad, after a tense and excruciating hour of careful examination with robotic probes and sensors, declared his volcano to be exactly what it was, an astonishingly clever and entirely harmless science project. The threat was officially declared a hoax. The rising action. The true battle began the moment the yellow tape came down. While the official law enforcement investigation into the false threat was just beginning its slow, methodical work, Carol Peterson launched her own insidious, multi-pronged campaign against us. The first escalation was a subtle but frustrating abuse of her minor position of power. As a long-standing member of the HOA's Architectural Review Committee, she flagged a minor permit application I had submitted weeks earlier to install a small, quiet, and code-compliant ventilation fan in our garage. The fan was intended to help clear the harmless fumes from Jordan's experiments, a simple safety precaution. The permit was suddenly and inexplicably denied, citing a vague and selectively enforced bylaw about maintaining the aesthetic uniformity of garage exteriors. It was a petty bureaucratic maneuver, a clear act of retaliation designed to make it more difficult and uncomfortable for Jordan to continue his work. The second shocking incident was a direct and vicious attack on the very foundation of my life, my fitness as a parent. A formal, anonymous complaint was filed with the county's Child Protective Services. The complaint was a work of paranoid fiction, alleging that a single father on our street was endangering his minor child by allowing him to handle and store unstable hazardous chemicals in an unsecured residential garage. It described noxious fumes, strange humming noises at all hours, and small explosions. A grotesque and malicious exaggeration of Jordan's harmless experiments. The result was a waking nightmare. A CPS investigator, a weary but professional woman named Ms. Albright, had to come to our home. It was a mandatory visit. She had to inspect the garage, which I had to unlock and open for her inspection. She had to review the material safety data sheets for every single chemical Jordan was using, all of which were common school-safe compounds like potassium iodide and concentrated hydrogen peroxide. And then, the worst part, she had to interview Jordan alone without me present. The humiliation and fear this caused my son was immeasurable. He felt like a criminal in his own home, his passion twisted into something illicit and dangerous. I stood in the kitchen, my hands clenched into fists, my heart pounding with a rage so profound it was difficult to breathe, all while maintaining a calm and cooperative demeanor. I knew with every fiber of my being that Carol was the source of the anonymous complaint. She had failed to stop the project through the HOA, so she had escalated dramatically, attempting to use the power of the state to declare me an unfit parent and to have my son's project, his passion, his dream taken away from him. When that failed, when CPS closed the case as unfounded within 48 hours, she resorted to her final, most desperate tactic. She must have seen the volcano magnificent and complete standing proudly in the gymnasium at the science fair. It was a symbol of her powerlessness, a monument to the threat she had been unable to contain through her lesser schemes. And so, with a voice disguised by a cheap voice-altering app and a disposable burner phone, she called in the bomb threat. Her campaign of harassment had been a systematic, calculated escalation. First, she had tried to obstruct his work through bureaucracy. Then she had tried to sever our family by branding me a negligent father. And finally, when all else failed, she had tried to brand my child as a terrorist. She was a woman who could not abide a world she could not control, and she was willing to burn down a child's dream and his reputation to feel safe. But the fire she started was about to rage back and consume her completely. My own investigation had already begun. As the FBI Field Supervisor for this district, I had resources at my disposal that Carol Peterson could not possibly fathom. She had made an anonymous call from a ghost phone, but in the modern world, there is no such thing as true anonymity. I would find her, and I would make her answer for what she had done to my son. The investigation began with the 911 call itself, a digital breadcrumb left in the ether. My tech team at the Bureau's regional headquarters isolated the recording. The voice was heavily distorted by a cheap software filter, a low-pitched robotic growl that failed to completely mask a certain tremor of panicked excitement. The words, however, were chillingly clear. The caller, identifying as a concerned parent, spoke of seeing a teenager setting up a very suspicious device with wires and chemical tanks and a pressure gauge that looked just like one of those bombs you see on TV. The caller refused to give a name, claimed to be afraid of retaliation, and ended the call abruptly. The call was made from a burner phone, a cheap, untraceable prepaid device activated only minutes before the call and never used again. For most local police departments, it would have been a frustrating dead end. But it was not a dead end for us. While the phone itself was now a ghost, the signal it transmitted during its brief life was not. We triangulated the cell tower data with a precision that could narrow the point of origin down to a 2-block radius in a commercial district a few miles from the school near a busy interstate exit. It's a needle in a haystack. Marcus, my lead tech agent, a sharp young man named Rick, who could see the world in lines of code, told me as we looked at the data map. This area is full of strip malls, gas stations, 1,000 cars passing through every hour. It could be anyone. Pull the tower logs for that entire sector for the last 72 hours. I ordered, my voice calm, masking the fierce urgency I felt. I want you to cross-reference every device that pinged in that radius with any device that also pinged within a quarter mile of Carol Peterson's home or Northwood Middle School in the same time frame. It's a long shot, a massive data pull, but let's see if we can find an echo. Let's see if our ghost left a digital footprint. While the powerful servers at Quantico began their Herculean task of sifting through millions of data points, I dug into Carol's life. I needed to understand the source of her pathology. What turns a nosy, controlling neighbor into someone willing to call in a bomb threat on a middle school science fair? My gut told me the answer was not simple racism or a garden variety personality disorder. The scale of her actions suggested a deeper, more foundational trauma. With a federal subpoena, I was able to access the sealed records of her late husband's police service file. Sergeant Frank Peterson had been a decorated police officer, a 20-year veteran of the force. He had been killed in the line of duty 15 years ago. The public story, the one in the papers, was that he had been shot and killed while responding to a domestic disturbance call. But the sealed and much thicker internal affairs report told a different, more complex, and far more horrifying story. This was the midpoint twist, the secret key that unlocked the dark, cobwebbed rooms of Carol Peterson's mind. Frank Peterson and his partner had responded to a call at a suburban house where a man, a known meth addict with a history of violence, was threatening his family. The situation was tense and volatile. According to the detailed report, which included transcripts of the radio traffic, Peterson's partner, a younger, more aggressive officer named Jack Riley, had advocated for an immediate dynamic entry, a full-on breach. Peterson, the senior officer, and a man known for his calm, methodical approach, had argued strenuously for a more cautious strategy, to establish a perimeter, to evacuate the surrounding homes, and to wait for the tactical team and negotiators to arrive. The partner, impatient and believing he could handle the situation himself, had disregarded Peterson's direct orders and had stormed the house. The meth addict, startled and high, had opened fire. In the ensuing chaos of the close-quarters gunfight, both Sergeant Frank Peterson and the suspect were killed. Jack Riley, the partner, had survived, but his career was over. He was found to have violated nearly every protocol in the book, and his reckless actions were deemed a direct cause of his partner's death. He was forced to resign in disgrace. But the key detail, the one that made the hair on my arm stand up, was the nature of the initial threat. The suspect had not just been armed with a gun. He had been building a large, sophisticated homemade explosive device in his basement. He was a self-taught chemist, a bomb maker, and he had been high on his own product. The domestic disturbance call had been minutes away from becoming a major domestic terrorism event. Carol Peterson's husband had been killed in a situation that started with a man building a dangerous device in his house. The unimaginable trauma of that event had clearly metastasized into a profound pathological paranoia. In her mind, any unusual activity, especially involving chemicals or devices or anything she didn't understand, was a potential precursor to the kind of catastrophic violence that had stolen her husband. Her fear wasn't just a personality quirk. It was a severe, untreated, and deeply rooted form of PTSD, a wound that had been festering for 15 long years. And then we moved in. A black family. The other. An unknown variable in her carefully controlled environment. And my son, a brilliant young chemist, began building a complex device, with strange chemicals, in our garage right next door. To her traumatized and prejudiced mind, history was not just rhyming, it was repeating itself. She saw Jordan not as a gifted child, but as the ghost of the man who had caused her husband's death. She saw me not as a concerned father, but as the negligent authority figure, just like the police department. She surely blamed who wasn't taking the threat seriously enough. Every one of her escalating actions, from the HOA complaint to the CPS call to the final desperate bomb threat, was a frantic attempt to prevent a tragedy that had already happened, to stop a ghost that only she could see. Just as this horrifying realization was sinking in, my phone buzzed. It was Rick from the tech lab. "I found your Echo, boss," he said, his voice grim. "It's not just an Echo. It's a damn duet." I rushed back to the office. "One burner phone," Rick explained, pointing at his screen. "Purchased for cash 2 days before the science fair at a convenience store in the commercial district. It pinged a tower there once for the 911 call. Then it went dark. But—" He typed a few commands, and a second data stream appeared on the screen. The personal cell phone of a disgraced former police officer named Jack Riley pinged the same cell tower at the same convenience store just 2 minutes before the burner phone was activated. He was there, Marcus. He pulled up a photo from the DMV database. It was a hard-faced man in his late 50s, his eyes filled with a bitter, resentful energy. It was Frank Peterson's partner, the man whose recklessness had gotten him killed. It all clicked into place, a dark and ugly mosaic. Carol wasn't just acting on her own paranoia. She was being enabled, encouraged, and actively manipulated by the one other person on Earth who shared her specific trauma and her warped, blame-filled view of the world. The disgraced ex-cop, bitter and ruined, had likely been a voice in her ear for years, reinforcing her belief that the system had failed them, that they were the only ones who saw the real threats. He had probably supplied the burner phone, advised her on the language to use the whole, twisted methodology. This wasn't just the act of a lone, disturbed woman. This was a conspiracy, however small and pathetic, born of shared grief and a twisted, desperate desire for a justice they could never truly have. The case had just become darker, more complex, and infinitely more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The community meeting, hastily arranged by the school district and held in the cavernous high school auditorium, was intended to be an exercise in reassurance and recovery. Instead, it became the stage for a final public dissection of a lie. The room was packed with hundreds of anxious parents, frustrated teachers, and bewildered students from across the district. The school superintendent, a man named Dr. Albright, and the middle school principal, Mrs. Davis, sat on the stage behind a long table, their faces grim. They were preparing to announce a host of new draconian security measures, including, as I had been tipped off, the likely cancellation of all future science fairs. The air in the room was thick with a palpable mixture of fear and suspicion, a poison that had seeped into the community. Carol Peterson sat in the third row, dressed in a tasteful gray suit, the very picture of quiet, concerned civic duty. She had come to witness the fruits of her labor, to see the threat she had identified officially neutralized by the panicked bureaucracy she had so effectively set in motion. And beside her, his face impassive and unreadable, sat Jack Riley. She had brought her co-conspirator to watch her moment of triumph. I sat in the back of the auditorium waiting. The U.S. Attorney for the district had given me full clearance to speak. The false threat had caused a massive public panic and had diverted significant federal resources, giving my office clear and undeniable jurisdiction. The priority now was no longer just the investigation. It was to de-escalate the community's fear with a powerful dose of cold, hard truth. Dr. Albright spoke first, his voice heavy with a weary regret, as he outlined the new security protocols, mandatory bag checks, increased police presence, and limited access to school grounds. When he finally announced that the district was indefinitely suspending events like the science fair that involved complex, externally sourced student projects, a wave of audible disappointment and anger swept through the student section. Then, he invited me to the stage. "We have with us tonight," he said, reading from a card, Special Agent in Charge Marcus Thorne of the FBI, who has graciously agreed to briefly update our community on the investigation into this very serious incident. A hush fell over the auditorium as I walked down the long aisle to the podium. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on me. I could feel Carol's eyes on me, her expression a mixture of surprise and profound unease. "Good evening." I began, my voice calm and steady, amplified by the state-of-the-art sound system, so that it filled every corner of the massive room. "I'm here tonight, not just as an FBI agent, but as a father. My son, Jordan Thorne, was one of your students. The suspicious device that caused this panic was his science project, a project he worked on for 4 months, a project that is a testament to his passion for science, his intellectual curiosity, and his hard work." I let that hang in the air for a beat. There was no bomb. I stated, my voice flat and unequivocal. There was no threat. What happened at Northwood Middle School last week was a hoax. A malicious, dangerous, and cowardly lie specifically designed to create exactly the kind of fear and division that we are seeing in this room tonight. I looked out at the sea of faces from the anxious parents to the frightened students. The 911 call that triggered this event was made anonymously from an untraceable burner phone by a person who used a software program to deliberately distort their voice. They claimed to be a concerned parent, but they were not concerned. They were malicious, and they were lying. I paused, then gave a subtle nod to my tech agent Rick, who was standing quietly at the back of the room by the audio-visual controls. The distorted growling voice from the 911 call suddenly filled the auditorium, a jarring, ugly sound. "Looks just like one of those bombs on TV. You have to do something before it's too late." The raw, manufactured panic in the voice was sickeningly effective. As the audio faded, I spoke into the silence. "We have identified the person who purchased that burner phone, and we have identified the person who made that call." The lights in the auditorium dimmed slightly, and the large projector screen behind the stage flickered to life. It showed a crystal-clear, time-stamped still image from the convenience store security camera. It was a perfect shot of Carol Peterson, her face unmistakable, standing at the counter, purchasing the burner phone. A collective gasp, like the sound of the air being sucked out of the room, rippled through the crowd. People twisted in their seats, their faces a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror to stare at Carol. Her face had gone ashen, a crumbling ruin of her earlier composure. Her mouth was slightly agape. She was trapped in the spotlight, exposed. Jack Riley, sitting beside her, went rigid, his eyes fixed on the screen. "But this story isn't just about one disturbed individual." I continued, my voice low and steady, drawing the focus back to me. "This is a story about how fear and grief, left untreated, can be twisted into something ugly and dangerous." The image on the screen changed. It was now a side-by-side display, Carol's photo next to a photo of Jack Riley. "This is Jack Riley, a disgraced former police officer. Mr. Riley was at the same store at the same time as Mrs. Peterson. He was Sergeant Frank Peterson's partner the day Sergeant Peterson was killed, responding to a domestic terrorism threat 15 years ago." I told them the whole story, the real story of her husband's death, the story of the bomb maker, the botched raid, the partner's catastrophic failure of judgment, and the long, festering wound of trauma. "Carol," I said, speaking directly to her now, across the stunned silence of the room, my voice softening, not with pity, but with a terrible diagnostic clarity. "Your grief for your husband is unimaginable. But you allowed that grief, and you allowed the bitterness of this man, Jack Riley, to poison you. You looked at my son, a child whose only passion is to understand the world, and you saw a monster from your past. In your desperation to prevent a tragedy that had already happened, you became the very thing you feared. You terrorized a school, you traumatized hundreds of children, and you tried to destroy a boy's dream because you were being haunted by a ghost. But I am here to tell you, the haunting is over." As if on cue, two of my plainclothes agents, who had been sitting quietly and unobtrusively in the audience, stood up. They walked calmly, deliberately down the aisle. The crowd parted for them, as if for specters. They stopped at Carol and Jack's row. "Carol Peterson, Jack Riley." The lead agent set his voice quiet, but carrying with absolute authority in the dead silence of the room. "You are both under arrest for conspiracy to convey a terrorism hoax, obstruction of justice, and multiple federal civil rights violations. Please stand up and put your hands behind your backs." The climax was not an explosion, but a quiet, methodical, and public dismantling of a dark and complex lie. As my agents led a now openly weeping Carol and a stoic, utterly defeated Riley from the auditorium, the community was left in a state of profound shock, forced to confront the devastating consequences of a fear that had been allowed to fester, unchecked in their midst, for far too long. The path to healing for all of them was about to begin. The arrests of Carol Peterson and Jack Riley sent a cleansing shockwave through the community, a stunning and decisive end to a saga of fear and manipulation that had begun with a child science project. The subsequent legal proceedings were a federal affair, and as such, they were swift and unyielding. Faced with the irrefutable evidence, the damning security footage, the cell phone data linking them, the deep psychological motive, and the testimony of the CPS worker and HOA committee members, both Carol and her co-conspirator saw the futility of a trial. The falling action was not about vengeance, but about the careful, multifaceted application of justice. Jack Riley, the bitter ex-cop, who had clearly acted as the architect and enabler of the plot, received a significant federal prison sentence for his role in the conspiracy and for violating the civil rights of a child. For Carol, the court, guided by a detailed pre-sentencing report from my office and a court-appointed psychiatric evaluation, took a more nuanced approach. Recognizing the profound and untreated trauma that had fueled her criminal actions, her sentence combined a necessary period of incarceration with a long-term mandatory commitment to a secure federal psychiatric facility. She was, in the end, held fully accountable for the terror she had caused, while also being directed towards the intensive help she had desperately needed for 15 years. Justice in her case looked like both punishment and a long overdue intervention. The resolution for the school and the wider community was a powerful and inspiring course correction, a testament to their capacity for self-reflection and growth. Dr. Albright, the superintendent, deeply humbled and publicly ashamed by the district's initial panicked reaction, became a champion for change. He publicly apologized to Jordan and my family at a televised press conference. He announced that not only would the science fair not be canceled, it would be rescheduled, expanded, and rebranded as the Northwood District Celebration of Science and Innovation. In a move that brought tears to my eyes, he announced that the event's new grand prize trophy would be named the Sergeant Frank Peterson Award for Courage in Scientific Inquiry. A deliberate act of reframing his legacy from one of tragic victimization to one that inspired a commitment to safety through understanding, not fear. Jordan, though shaken by the ordeal, found a new quiet strength in the aftermath. He had been targeted, vilified, and had his greatest passion twisted into something monstrous. But he refused to let the incident define him or his love for science. He worked closely with his supportive science teacher, Mr. Davis, to rebuild his project, making it even more impressive than before. He became a quiet hero among his peers, a symbol of resilience. The rescheduled science fair was a massive community event, a triumphant celebration of learning that brought together students, parents, and community members from all over the district. It was a joyful act of defiance against the fear that had threatened to consume them. Jordan's Mount St. Helens project was the undeniable centerpiece. This time, when he activated the final stage of the eruption, there were no screams of panic, only collective gasps of wonder, followed by a thunderous, sustained standing ovation. He was invited to the stage, where he gave a short, eloquent speech, his voice clear and steady. He didn't speak about his ordeal, about the arrest, or the trauma. He spoke about the power of the scientific method to illuminate the world, to replace fear and superstition with knowledge and understanding, and to bring people together in a shared sense of wonder. He won the grand prize, the inaugural Sergeant Frank Peterson Award, which came with a full scholarship to the state's Summer Science Institute. His dream, once targeted for destruction, was now gloriously publicly realized. For our family, the ending was a return to a new kind of normal, a peace that was deeper, more resilient, and more cherished than before. The ordeal had tested us in the most profound ways, but it had not broken us. It had reinforced my belief in the systems of justice I had dedicated my life to, but it had also deepened my understanding of the complex human wounds that can drive people to do terrible, unthinkable things. Several months later, I stood in the familiar happy clutter of our garage, watching Jordan carefully pack his suitcase for his trip to the Science Institute. He was meticulously labeling his equipment, his movements precise, and filled with a newfound confidence. The garage, once a point of contention and a source of fear for our neighbors, was once again his laboratory, his sanctuary of learning. "Got everything you need?" I asked, leaning against the doorframe. "I think so," he said, turning to me with a smile that was the perfect, brilliant echo of his mother's. He held up a small sealed container. I double-checked all the chemical manifests and submitted them for pre-approval. Don't want to cause another federal incident. I laughed, a real deep laugh of relief and boundless pride. We had faced the worst of one person's darkness and had overcome it with the best of our community's hope. The shadows of the past had been brought into the light, and the future, for my son, was as bright and limitless as the stars he was so eager to understand. He was not just my son. He was a testament to the enduring power of reason, resilience, and the simple, beautiful truth that knowledge embraced with courage will always, in the end, extinguish fear.